He was the last English king to die in battle, depicted by Shakespeare as a scheming hunchback.
Beneath a modern city that sells itself on shopping streets and football Saturdays, the ground kept a secret that had outlasted dynasties. For nearly 5 centuries, the story of King Richard III's end sat in that hazy place where history turns into legend. A defeated king cut down in the chaos of Bosworth, dragged away, mocked, buried without ceremony, and then gradually reshaped into whatever each era needed him to be. But when a skeleton was lifted from Leicester soil and genetic testing stitched bone to bloodline, the old ambiguity collapsed. The DNA did not recreate the battle, but it pinned the body to the name with enough certainty that every cut and crack became personal. Once the identity was no longer a debate, the violence recorded in that skeleton stopped being an abstract medieval ending and started reading like a forensic report on a king's final minutes. And what it suggested about his death was grim in a way that no chronicle flourish can soften. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. To understand why DNA mattered so much, it helps to remember how slippery medieval identification can be. Battles scatter men, graves are moved, churches are rebuilt, and rumor fills the gaps. Richard's burial was described as hasty and unglamorous, and the site was believed to have been lost after centuries of redevelopment. Even the outline of his body in public memory had been bent by politics. Tudor writers had every incentive to paint a defeated rival as monstrous, and later storytellers leaned into the drama. Archaeology could locate bones, but bones alone can be argued with. Height estimates vary, injuries can be misread, and the temptation to match evidence to expectation is always there. DNA changed the game because it offered a thread that could run from a 15th century skeleton to living descendants through a maternal line. It did not need a crown, a signet ring, or an intact tomb inscription. It needed biology, paperwork, and patience. The result of that testing did something quietly revolutionary. It made the body difficult to mythologize. Once the genetic link established that these remains were Richard's, the skeleton became a kind of unwilling witness. Every wound could be discussed without slipping into the comforting vagueness of someone in that era. It was him. The broken skull, the blade marks, the pattern of trauma across the skeleton were not general medieval brutality. They were the physical punctuation at the end of a specific reign, at the end of a specific life whose reputation had been fought over for centuries. The DNA did not say how he died, but it made it impossible to dismiss the skeletal evidence as belonging to a different soldier, a different noble, a different unlucky man. In that sense, DNA was the lock snapping shut on the identification, and the key turning to open the harder door. What exactly was done to him? The bones told a story that is bad, not because it is surprising that a medieval king died violently, but because of the particular quality of the violence. The skull injuries were not a single clean strike that ended everything. They were multiple traumatic events, suggesting repeated blows to the head, some of them severe enough to be fatal on their own. That matters because it reshapes the emotional geometry of the moment. A king can be killed by chance in a melee, a lucky thrust, or a fall. Multiple head wounds imply a target being hit again and again, an encounter that kept going as the victim's capacity to defend himself collapsed. It suggests close range, frantic, intentional force. It suggests a body that became an objective, something to be finished, not merely stopped. There is also the fact that the injuries indicate vulnerability. Some patterns are consistent with a helmet being compromised or removed, or with the head being exposed at the crucial instant. Medieval armor, especially for someone of Richard's status, was meant to make killing him difficult. A king was not supposed to be easy to reach. The skeleton's wounds imply that at some point the protective system failed. Straps cut, visor opened, helmet knocked aside, the last layer gone. Once that happened, the fight would have changed from "can we bring him down" to "how quickly can we end him?" That shift is where the badness deepens, because it hints at a moment where the king's battlefield identity flipped. He went from an armored symbol surrounded by allegiance to a vulnerable man whose death could seal a war. The torso and pelvic region complicate it further. Evidence consistent with post-mortem injury has been discussed in connection with his remains, pointing toward indignity after death. That idea is ugly, but it is also historically plausible. The body of a defeated leader could be used as propaganda, and humiliation could be as strategic as it was cruel. A king's corpse was not just a corpse, it was a message. If the bones show trauma that is unlikely to have been delivered in the heat of combat, it implies a second phase of violence, where the body was no longer fighting back. That is a different moral category of harm. It moves from killing to violating. It suggests that the end of Richard's life was not merely a military conclusion, but a public demonstration, an assertion that the old order was not simply defeated, but degraded. And this is where DNA's role becomes emotionally catalytic. Without genetic confirmation, the temptation exists to keep the discussion abstract. Medieval warfare was brutal, bodies were mishandled, injuries happened. With confirmation, the abstraction dissolves. Richard's death becomes a case study in what happens when political conflict makes a person into a symbol that must be erased. The violence starts to look like something directed not only at a man, but at an idea of legitimacy. A king is killed, yes, but the repeated wounds, the apparent stripping of protection, the possibility of post-mortem insult all point toward a desire to make the death unambiguous. Not an accident, not a mistaken casualty, a definitive ending. This has implications that ripple outward without needing to drift into what happened afterward. First, it forces a rebalancing of the way we read historical narratives that were designed to persuade. Richard's reputation was shaped by victors, and victors do not merely record, they craft. For centuries, Richard has been portrayed in extremes, either as a villain whose violent death was deserved, or as a wronged figure swallowed by propaganda. Forensic evidence is indifferent to deservedness. It does not argue ideology, it simply reveals what occurred to flesh and bone. When those bones show concentrated trauma, the evidence pushes readers to see the final act less as poetic justice or tragic martyrdom, and more as the predictable outcome of a war where personal identity could be reduced to political utility. The king's body becomes a battlefield for narrative as much as the field itself was a battlefield for power. Second, it reframes the medieval battlefield in a way that is more intimate and less romantic. Popular imagination loves the clean geometry of two armies, banners snapping, heroic charges. Forensic injury patterns tell a messier truth. Combat compresses into clusters of bodies. Decisions happen in seconds, and killing can be a sustained action rather than a single stroke. Richard's remains imply close engagement, multiple strikes, and a moment of exposure that led to catastrophic injury. That does not sound like the choreographed duel of legend. It sounds like panic, adrenaline, and men trying to end an opponent who mattered too much to leave alive. The king's last minutes in this view were not the grand arc of a tragic hero, but the violent churn of hand-to-hand struggle. Third, the DNA-backed identification changes how we think about historical certainty. For a long time, Richard's burial site, and even the details of his physical form, were debated in ways that allowed ideology to creep into scholarship. The moment DNA linked the remains to Richard, an entire class of argument collapsed. That does not mean every historical question becomes easy, but it demonstrates how scientific methods can close the gap between likely and demonstrable. The implication is not that science replaces history, but that it can discipline it. It can force historians to confront material facts that do not care about literary tradition. In Richard's case, that discipline is uncomfortable because it takes a story that people like to argue about and pins it to evidence that is hard to spin. There's also a deeply human implication about identity and dignity. DNA is often talked about as a modern miracle, a way to solve mysteries, catch criminals, reunite families. Here it did something stranger. It restored a name to bones that had been anonymous and disputed. That is a kind of belated recognition, and it comes with a moral tension. On one hand, it feels like truth finally reaching across time. On the other hand, it exposes violence in a way that can verge on voyeurism. When we talk about skull wounds and blade marks, we are talking about a person's suffering. The implications are a reminder that the past is not just a set of stories we can reshape for entertainment. It is a ledger of real bodies that broke. DNA's power is that it makes that reality harder to dodge. The bad part of the revelation also chips away at comforting assumptions about kingship. Richard was not just a participant in the Wars of the Roses, he was the embodiment of a claim to rule. Kings are often discussed as if they hover above ordinary vulnerability. Their deaths become symbols, the fall of a house, the end of an era. But a skeleton with trauma insists on a simpler truth: royal blood does not stop steel. Whatever armor and attendance a king has, his body remains a human body. The implications here are sobering, because they show how quickly political theology can dissolve into physical fragility. A crowned man can end up with lethal blows to the back of the skull like any other combatant, and the world will move on. At the same time, the evidence invites a sharper question about intent. If the injuries suggest repeated blows after he was already incapacitated, it implies not merely the chaotic brutality of war, but the psychological charge of killing a king. In a medieval context, regicide is not just killing. It is a rupture in the order of things. Even in battle, striking down an anointed ruler carries weight, and that weight can produce extremes: hesitation, fear, or the opposite, a kind of frenzied determination to make sure the deed is done. The bone record cannot read minds, but it can hint at behavior, and behavior can hint at emotion. The implication is that Richard's death may have been shaped by more than tactical necessity. It may have been shaped by the energy of ending a reign, by the heat of hatred or the urgency of preventing rescue, by the desire to erase a claim so thoroughly that it could not rise again. Another implication is how this changes the relationship between text and evidence. Chronicles and later retellings describe Richard dying in battle, sometimes emphasizing courage, sometimes emphasizing downfall. But texts can exaggerate, compress, or dramatize. A wound pattern is less flexible. If the skeleton suggests a sequence of violence that is more sustained or more humiliating than the traditional narrative implies, it pressures historians to revisit how the story has been told. That does not mean every written source becomes untrustworthy, but it does mean that physical evidence can expose where writing has been selective. If writers minimized indignity to preserve a certain tone, or amplified cruelty to justify a regime, the bones stand as an independent check. DNA, by confirming whose bones these are, gives that check real authority. What makes the identification so unsettling is how quickly it turns the last day from a distant set piece into a sequence that can be interrogated almost minute by minute. Once the skeleton is anchored to Richard by genetics, the surrounding evidence stops being decorative context and becomes part of a tight web of inference. The distribution of injuries can be weighed against what armor would normally protect, what kinds of strikes are feasible in a crush of bodies, and which blows would likely happen only when someone had already been forced off balance. It becomes less about a dramatic end and more about mechanics, angles, force, reach, and the ugly efficiency of men who know that the person in front of them cannot be allowed to escape. That shift matters because it changes how the event is mentally pictured, and it changes what questions we treat as legitimate. One implication is the collapse of the old comfort that chivalric ideals govern the killing of high-status opponents. Medieval culture loved the language of honor, ransom, and knightly conduct, and those ideas certainly shaped behavior at times, but the physical record associated with Richard points toward an ending where the priority was not a clean capture or a ceremonious defeat. The king's status didn't wrap him in protection once the fight narrowed down to a lethal pocket of violence. That doesn't mean every opponent was devoid of restraint, but it does imply that the code could be overwritten by the stakes. If the enemy king is in reach, and if his death can resolve a conflict instantly, the incentives can turn even honorable warfare into something raw. The implication is that the idealized medieval battlefield, the one people like to imagine as rules-bound, was always fragile, dependent on circumstances that could shatter in seconds. Another implication is how the event forces a rethink of leadership in combat. Richard's death is often discussed in moral or political terms, but the forensic dimension invites tactical and human questions. Why was he close enough for such close-range violence to be possible? What did it mean for a king to physically enter the most dangerous space? And what does that say about the expectations placed on rulers? It underlines that medieval kingship could demand visibility that bordered on self-endangerment. A leader who hangs back risks being called a coward. A leader who pushes in risks being swallowed. The evidence doesn't tell you what he felt, but it pushes you to imagine the pressure cooker of being both a commander and the most valuable target on the field. The implication is that the crown was not just a political instrument, it was a liability that pulled danger toward its wearer like gravity. The confirmed identity also highlights how much historical certainty depends on the marriage of different kinds of proof. A skeleton can show trauma, but trauma without identity is a kind of anonymous brutality. Written accounts can describe a death, but accounts without physical corroboration can be shaped, mistaken, or deliberately theatrical. DNA sits in the middle, not as a storyteller, but as a validator of which body you are looking at. That has a broader implication for how we evaluate contentious episodes. It suggests that the most persuasive reconstructions won't come from one discipline dominating, but from different kinds of evidence constraining each other. Genetics narrows who, osteology narrows what, and context narrows why this way rather than that. The event becomes an example of history, becoming less like a courtroom argument over competing narratives and more like an investigation where each line of evidence limits the other's freedom to wander. It also changes how we think about violence as communication. Killing a king is never only about removing a person. It is about signaling that a claim is finished. When a death is messy, when the physical evidence hints at relentless, up-close damage, it suggests not only the presence of violence, but the presence of emphasis. Emphasis is a form of messaging. On a battlefield, that message is directed in multiple directions at once. At allies who might still fight, at enemies who might still rally, at neutral observers who will later decide which story to believe. The implication is that the event was not just the collapse of a man, but a moment where the struggle over legitimacy condensed into a physical act. A ruler's end could serve as a kind of punctuation mark that everyone could read, regardless of literacy or loyalty. The more unmistakable the punctuation, the harder it is for doubt to survive. There is also an implication about how easily a body can be stripped of the protections that normally surround rank. In life, a king is buffered by etiquette, distance, and the careful management of access. In battle, those buffers can evaporate, and the same hierarchy that elevates him also concentrates risk. Confirming Richard's identity makes that vulnerability feel stark, because it exposes how thin the line is between symbol and specimen. It's a reminder that political systems depend on controlling proximity. Who can get close, who can touch, who can strike. The battlefield is the place where proximity is least controllable. Once the king is within reach, the entire architecture of reverence can collapse into physical contact, and physical contact is where power becomes mortal. The implication reaches beyond Richard. It suggests that many dramatic turning points in history may have hinged on chaotic moments of access rather than on grand strategies alone. The event also illuminates how memory can become addicted to neat endings and how evidence refuses that neatness. People tend to want a single decisive act, one heroic blow, one fatal mistake, one clear moral lesson. A body that shows multiple injuries pushes against that craving. It suggests that endings can be cumulative, that death can be a process rather than an instant, that the last chapter of a life can contain several attempts, some successful, some redundant, some driven by panic or hatred or sheer momentum. The implication is uncomfortable because it makes it harder to turn the event into a clean parable. It doesn't offer the satisfying simplicity of fate. It offers an image of violence that is repetitive, opportunistic, and physical in the most unpoetic sense. That challenges not only popular storytelling, but the way historians sometimes unconsciously favor tidy causal chains. On a deeper level, genetic confirmation forces a confrontation with how reputations are built on assumptions about bodies. A disputed identity allows people to slide past the material reality and argue endlessly about what must have happened. Once the remains are tied to Richard, the argument has to start with what is actually there. That shift has implications for how we treat other controversial figures whose lives are caught between propaganda and devotion. It suggests a model where the body, when available, becomes a grounding point that can prevent debates from floating entirely into ideology. This doesn't decide questions of guilt or virtue, but it changes the texture of discussion by insisting on a shared baseline. Whatever else he was, his end involved a specific pattern of harm. That shared baseline can cool some debates and inflame others, but it makes it harder for anyone to claim certainty without reckoning with the physical record. There's an implication, too, about how identity itself can be both stabilized and destabilized by DNA. Genetics is often treated as the ultimate anchor, proof that ends disputes. Yet the same science that can confirm a match can also reveal complexity in family lines, inheritance, and recorded ancestry. In cases of royal genealogy, where legitimacy is entwined with bloodlines, the possibility of unexpected discontinuities is not just a scientific curiosity, it is politically resonant. Even without turning the event into a separate genealogical drama, the implication is clear. The past certainty about who belonged to whom was never as clean as official records pretended. That doesn't rewrite Richard's death, but it sharpens the irony that the same tool used to secure his identity also reminds us how often lineage is a story people tell as much as a biological fact. Finally, the event carries an implication about empathy that doesn't depend on admiration or condemnation. For centuries, it has been easy to treat Richard as an emblem. The last Plantagenet, the villain of a stage, the symbol of a lost cause, the lesson in ambition. Genetic identification drags him back toward personhood. A person can be blamed or defended, but a person can also be imagined in pain, off balance, frightened, fighting, and then silent. The confirmed body makes it harder to keep him in the safe distance of caricature. It invites the uneasy recognition that even the most politically charged deaths are still deaths, experienced from the inside by someone whose last sensations were not ideology but impact, pressure, heat, and the sudden failure of the body to keep going. That recognition doesn't absolve him, and it doesn't convict him. It simply changes the moral temperature of the event by refusing to let it stay abstract. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are thoughts on DNA evidence revealing King Richard's death? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.